it came to light that some of these canines are working beyond their retirement time. So they've meant to retired already, and yet these poor canines are working, but they didn't do it because they were forced to. They loved that work.
Is South Africa capable of dealing with natural disasters, the likes of which we recently saw in the April floods in KwaZulu-Natal? I posed this question to Grant Tyson and Ivor Rimmer of Search and Rescue South Africa in a recent episode of my podcast, Solutions with David Ansara. If you enjoy this short extract, you can watch the full interview with Grant and Ivor. That's linked in the description below. Enjoy. I'd like to talk about just the capacity of the state to deal with crises of this nature and to respond to disasters. So obviously there was this legislative action of this state of disaster. But you are working a lot with SAPS, with the SANDF, with various other volunteer groups as well. I mean, do you think that we have the readiness and the capacity to deal with disasters of this scale?
If I could answer that, I think the people on the ground had the passion and the will to want to help. What they lack is the support from, and I'm going to refer to it as head office, to be able to do that. You know, the way we keep up to date is we train, and we do training, and we do training exercise and scenarios and all those kind of things. That's what helps us get in to do this. But people have seen the need or have not seen the need to do that. So the SAPS people in search and rescue, you know, they're just starting to come in, but we should have been doing training for the last 20 odd years, because suddenly you get caught short now. And it's not the people on the ground. They want it. They want to do it. But they're also sometimes working too hard with normal day-to-day stuff, because the units have got smaller and smaller as budgets have been constrained. So once again, let's journalistic refer to it as head office or cutting back on the budgets, and we haven't got budget for an exercise, and you're too busy doing that. And you know, go back a year ago in KZN when we had the riots, all leave was cancelled for all these people. So they were, all their leave was cancelled for the last 6 months. And now suddenly they're confronted with something like this, where yes, you get in and you keep going there month after month, trying to get the infrastructure right and the systems going. They are still human beings. They need to take leave. They need to recharge their batteries. And if we can do nothing else but support those people on the ground with us as the force multipliers to bring in that kind of resource and help them, then they just get that feeling they're not just doing it on their own. It's bad enough you're battling the elements, but you don't want to be battling the bureaucracy at the same time.
Yeah, many of these personnel are risking their lives, their physical security to perform these acts of service. So I definitely think we don't want to be painting everyone in the state with the same brush, but definitely there seems to be a leadership vacuum at the top, of very kind of poor management structures as well. Grant, what are your thoughts on the capacity of the state?
So in terms of the capacity, what worried me and what scared me more than anything else is when we were doing a briefing in the morning there, and you had all the resources and all the members that were involved in the search all standing around in a circle, listening to the incident command, dishing out the orders for the day. If you took a look around, and apart from the SARZA team, if you took a look around at the members that were passionately involved on the ground there, I would say they were probably in excess of 48, 49 years old, gray beards, gray hair, and there was no youth. Where was the youth of the system? Where is the depth that should have been created, where young rescuers are coming up, they're being assisted, guided, trained, and funding has been put together to bring this along? Whether it's a canine resource, whether it's a human being, whether it's vehicles, boats, helicopters, whatever the case may be, there was no depth in what I could see in that type of scenario. And it's worrying, because what happens when all those gray-haired old men toodle off and retire, and they're too old to actually go out and pull bodies out or go and dig and go do whatever they need to? Where's the youth going to come from? Where are they? And that to me was a major worry, as we don't seem to be having that depth within the government services. So right now, will we handle a national disaster? Absolutely. You've got force multipliers like us coming on board and helping and assisting. What's going to happen in the future? That to me is a bigger worry.
Yeah, and I think we need more young people, civic-minded people to make that sacrifice that the older generation has made. Ivor?
But we also need people in the system to do that. They've got to be trained up. You know, one draws the analogy back to an ESCOM. you know that we have to take a power station, has to be taken offline and maintained and serviced or whatever, whether it's your car, whether it's a power station, that process. And there has to be enough capacity in the grid to live without that one. Whereas we've just run everything flat out, unclip brakes, and then we fix it. And that's not the way to run your power grid, but it's also not the way to run your rescue services. We've got enough people to do the job, but have we spent time? Some of those sage old greyheads should be training up the next people coming along, because as Grant says, when they've all retired in 10 years' time, who's going to do it then? I would suggest that while there were enough helicopters flying around KZN, if you'd asked for a helicopter anywhere else in the country, you would have been surprised because they weren't available, because the ones we had that could fly were all in KZN. Now, that shouldn't be the case, that we lose everything. And yet when we've wanted to send teams overseas, but what happens if something happens in South Africa? We need to have enough people. But we need to go overseas because we will learn and experience things there that we can bring back. So when it happens on our doorstep, we know what to do about it. And that's very much part of these processes. Why do we send teams overseas to go and assist there? Haven't we got enough trouble here? When the real trouble comes here, and what we learned in the Philippines, what we learned in Mozambique, what we learned in Malawi, we put into practice in KZN. If we hadn't been there, we'd be doing it for the first time. And that's not the right place to do it.
So Grant, Ivor mentioned the dogs, and you work very closely with the SAP's canine unit. How does that relationship work, and why are the animals so important in your work?
So what a canine can do versus what a human can do in sniffing out and searching for missing bodies or buried bodies, for that fact, is unbelievable. That nose on that canine is absolutely phenomenal. The sad problem is what we were led to believe, that all 16 canine dogs that were down in KZN was the entire country's complement of search dogs. And same story there. There was no depth. And I look at those canines as a fellow rescuer. And unfortunately, when we lost Leah, one of the canines, in an unfortunate incident where a very highly qualified SAPS diver also lost her life, and the canine went in after, it came to light that some of these canines are working beyond their retirement time. So they've meant to retired already, and yet these poor canines are working, but they didn't do it because they were forced to. They loved that work. They absolutely pushed it literally to the end. So working with canines is it's an honor for us, because we get to see the way they operate. We also train with them sometimes as well, to make sure that we understand how to operate with them and how to be a flanker and what to do and what not to do in certain situations. But watching those canines operate in those fields, in that debris and the rubble, and when they can pick up the scent of a body, when us as a human being, you've got that smell of death throughout the valley, throughout this gorge that had been washed away, to see that canine pick up a spot and you start digging there and you're guaranteed to find something, is phenomenal. So it's great to work with them, and we look to them as fellow rescuers. So they're part of the team, and it's always great to work with the canine.
Yeah, and unfortunately that officer also lost her life. What was the story there?
So, I've got a bit frustrated sometimes when you hear in the news and the media that, oh no, it was probably because they were badly trained and things. Absolutely nonsense. She was one of the most qualified dive rescuers, and I think she was the only black female dive rescuer qualified to that level in the South African Police Force. So it was just her name was Busi. So it was just a very unfortunate incident. It's a dangerous environment that you're working. Bearing in mind, you're working in a disaster area where there is stuff that's not normal. The boulders are 10 times the size because the rivers have been cleared and washed away. And unfortunately, she was walking along a riverbank and you couldn't see it, but underneath, the river had washed away from underneath. So it caused a little bit of a cliff overhang. And while searching on the bank, looking into the water for possible survivors or possible bodies to recover, etc., the bank collapsed. And she went in, and it happened to be close to a weir, which then obviously sucked her down into the pipes that feed the water to the other side. The canine handler saw this. He reacted and shouted. The canine then obviously bolted, went in straight after to see if he could get to her, and they were both pulled under, unfortunately. So very sad event indeed, and it was a massive loss to the rescue community to lose a fellow rescuers in canine and between Leah and Busi. So a very sad note, but there is a bit of a happy side story to it. And if I may, there was a little puppy that was picked up in town on the way back from one of the calls. And that puppy was cleaned up, had all its injections. It had the vet gave it a bath, and the canine handler that lost his canine took on this new little puppy and said, this is what it's going to be his new canine. And he named it after Bussy and Leah. So very heartwarming story indeed. And when I did share that story on our trip back from KZN, I can guarantee you there was not a dry eye in any of those vehicles driving back. So because it pulls on the heartstrings, unfortunately, especially when you lose someone close to you.
And little puppy Bussy Lee is probably the happiest puppy in KZN right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's a beautiful illustration of the sacrifices that people are prepared to make for others. And I think if we can instill that as part of our civic culture and civic responsibility, I think that South Africa can achieve great things. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this conversation, you might want to check out the full interview. That's linked over here. You can also subscribe to my other channel. That's linked over here. My name is David Ansara. Until next time, take care.